The readings this week are a small sample of the range of topics and issues that impact human rights related to gender constructs in societies around the world. While most of the emphasis is on women's failure to achieve full human rights, there is space to discuss how gender systems also prevent men from achieving human rights, and this is sometimes done more intentionally by modern writers than in the past. However, given that poverty, violence, sexual assault, hunger, malnutrition, and disease disproportionately affect women, much of the international attention falls on the plight of women. Much of the literature and goals of organizations focus on violence against women, but those are not the only topics of concern. Some of these other concerns include women's reproductive rights. This is a range of issues from pregnancy care to female genital mutilation and abortion. Women's educational rights. This includes countries that prohibit the education of women, but also is relevant around the world as historically women have been less preferential for receiving education. It also includes the concerns over career and financial security, women's ability to own land, have credit in their names, or complete financial transactions without a male relative are common in the developing world and existed in the legal structures of the United States up until the 1970s. So women's legal equality under the law is new, and equality in practice is still questionable in those places when you investigate issues like the wage gap between male and female earners in general, and also other issues like child care burdens and the cost of family leave for women. The field also concerns itself with gender roles and how these affect the development of societies and individuals, male and female. As Charlotte Bunch notes in the article from 1990, women's rights for the first half of the UN's existence were primarily seen as a secondary set of rights, not really human rights in the greater sense. It is important to point out that this article represented the priority changes that women's rights advocates were pushing for in international and domestic organizations in the 1990s, and this effort shaped the UN discussion that led to the UN Women's Conference in Beijing, organized by the Commission on the Status of Women in 1995. This was a historic conference that sought to establish women's rights as high priorities in the United Nations human rights programs, tying together various types of human rights violations to the deprivation of women of equal rights. While many of the concerns and facts related to women's rights articulated in the 1990s are emphasized in discussions in international relations and organizations today, the actual situations facing women have not greatly improved outside of developed countries. Arguably, the situation in developed countries still has a ways to go as well. The topic also inherently engages an upcoming discussion related to LGBTQ plus rights. Scholars perceive that gender roles enforced in societies are largely the motivation behind homophobia, and that sexism and homophobia are thus closely linked. Many organizations, states, and participants in the UN at the time of this writing did not acknowledge that the violence occurring against women occurs because they are women, and that being women is their primary risk factor. Gender-based abuse is one of the most challenging to the field of human rights and one of the most often neglected. Few governments have exhibited more than token commitment to women's equality as a basic human right in the domestic or foreign policy field, and no government has used women's equality as a determination for foreign aid or trade. Among non-governmental organizations, women's rights were not prioritized, and when it was suggested that governments or human rights organizations respond, they've often argued that sex discrimination is too trivial or will come after larger issues of survival are addressed. Abuses of women are cultural, private, or an individual and not a political matter, that women's rights are not human rights per se, or that abuse of women is inevitable or so pervasive that it is futile to combat it. As the author acknowledges, the narrow definition of human rights driven by Western focus on civil and political liberties also keeps women's rights from becoming a focus. Even though some important aspects of women's rights fit into civil liberties, much of the abuse against women is part of a larger socioeconomic web that entraps women, making them vulnerable to abuses which cross over into various other rights, such as the right to food, shelter, and work. Addressing all of these concerns is vital to their full realization of rights. The author answers the idea that human rights are trivial or secondary to concerns of survival by pointing out the various ways that sexism kills. To document a few, amniocentesis is used to select for abortion of female fetuses in places like Bombay. and India as well as China. In India and in China, more males than females have been born since at least the 90s, which has resulted today in a gender imbalance in both of these regions. The rate of violence against women has seemingly grown in the past few decades. In many countries, girls are fed less, taken to doctors less frequently, and die or are physically maimed by malnutrition at higher rates than boys, according to the WHO. In adulthood, denial of women's right to reproductive choices threatens their lives, as is exemplified in Latin America, where complications from illegal abortions were the leading cause of death for women between the ages of 15 and 39. Violence against women is more or less the exemplar of the limited concept of human rights. Rather than treat it as random violence, policymakers at all levels should recognize that the risk factor is being female and that victims are chosen for their gender. Sex discrimination, when combined with class, race, and other forms of oppression, what we would call intersectionality, constitutes a deadly denial of women's right to life and liberty on a large scale throughout the world. In the U.S., homicide is the fourth most common killer of women, and in 1990, battery to women was the most common reason for women's injury. Rape is extremely common, with about 1/3 of women experiencing sexual assault in their lifetime. In Peru, 70% of all crimes reported to police in 1990 were men who had beaten their partners, and rape is also rampant there. Kitchen burnings, domestic violence, and nutritional neglect plague women in India, and in France, 95% of the victims of violence are women. As she writes, where recorded, domestic battery victims range from 40 to 80% of women beaten, usually repeatedly, indicating that the home is the most dangerous place for women and frequently the site of cruelty and torture. It is often argued that violence against women is cultural or personal, but it is also very political, reflecting the structural relationships of power and privilege between men and women. Violence against women keeps women in their place and maintains power structures at home, work, and in public life. Violence against women breeds more inequality of women because it results in lack of female representation in high-paying careers and government jobs. Failure to recognize this oppression results in the exclusion of sex discrimination and violence against women from the human rights agenda. Researchers with concern about violence against women frame the problem as one of physical, emotional, and mental control, but very often in real life and in scholarship, the struggle over women's bodies is at the center of personal abuse as well as politics. Feminists in the 1970s wrote that the personal is political, when personal issues like reproductive rights, freedom of sexuality, laws that criminalize rape and marriage, etc., are not in the hands of women but in the hands of men. This contributes to human rights abuses against them. The state's responsibility for women's human rights has often been denied based on the public-private dichotomy, the idea that women's places in the home and the public realm belongs to men. Issues around home are considered private, and women's treatment falls in that realm, so the state sees itself as respecting privacy and culture when it does not intervene. The real questions, as the author recognizes, is who decides what are legitimate human rights and when the state should become involved. So far, the dominant group, men, has made this decision about what is private and what is public, as well as what human rights violations should receive a priority. The lower priority of women is evident in international organizational structures. As they point out, the Human Rights Commission has more power to hear and investigate cases than the Commission on the Status of Women. It has more staff and budget and better mechanisms for implementing its findings. It makes a difference in what can be done if a case is deemed a violation of women's rights versus human rights. The definition of human rights affects human rights. For example, refugee status not being given to those experiencing sexual persecution and violence against women. It may be taken into account, but no European state nor the United States makes sexual repression the grounds for refugee status. As mentioned before in previous discussions about refugees, women are not seen as a particular political group except in rare circumstances. Horrendous examples of women being denied asylum in terrible circumstances include the Bangladeshi women who had been raped during the Pakistan-Bangladesh War and faced honor killings at the hands of male relatives if they did not receive asylum, but who were returned home anyway. The West took a minimalist approach in renouncing these actions. The author observes four basic approaches to linking rights to human rights. The first is seeing women's rights as civil and political rights. This is the first generation of rights, and they say it should consider women, so focus on raising the visibility of women who suffer general human rights violations, as well as call attention to particular abuses that women suffer because they are women. The focus is also on violence against women because it is connected to other violations like torture and rape. Also, lack of maternal care and detention is an issue that is connected to physical integrity. This approach also involves documenting problems of women refugees and developing responsive policies. Women and children make up more than 80% of those in refugee camps, yet few refugee policies are specifically shaped to meet the needs of those vulnerable populations. The next approach is to include a discussion of women into the second generation of human rights, rights to food, shelter, health care, and employment. This is the approach that corrects the overly Western emphasis on individualism and identifies women's oppression as primarily economic. This is common to socialists and labor activists who have argued that political human rights are meaningless without economic rights. The viewpoint focuses on how ending economic subordination can address other problems like violence against women because it reduces women's inability to leave and provide for themselves. Violence also has negative consequences for economic and social productivity. Issues that impact women's health, like injuries and lost time at work, cost countries and companies in total productivity. Women's rights in the law is the next approach. This approach involves creating new legal mechanisms to counter sex discrimination, seeking to make existing legal and political institutions work for women and expand the state's responsibility for violation of human rights. National and local laws addressing sexual discrimination and violence against women are examples, and these allow women to fight for their rights within the legal system. The primary international version is the CEDAW, the Convention to End All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This convention has been described as essentially an international Bill of Rights for women and a framework for women's participation in the development process. It spells out internationally accepted principles and standards for achieving equality between men and women, but CEDAW does not address violence against women. Moreover, the convention is not seen as having very strong enforcement or compliance capabilities. There has been difficulty getting governments to comply with reporting requirements. The convention is treated, therefore, by governments and most non-governmental organizations as a document dealing with women's rights, not human rights. But it is an important statement of principles endorsed by the UN and has a significance for helping women organize in their regions. The fourth approach is the feminist transformation of human rights, the idea that you should transform the rights concept to a feminist perspective, looking at the violations in women's lives and asking how the human rights concept can change and be more responsive to women. The transformative approach can be taken toward any issue, but usually the focus is on abuses that arise specifically out of gender, like reproductive rights, female sexual slavery, violence against women, and family crimes like forced marriage, compulsory heterosexuality, and female mutilation. These are also the issues that most often are dismissed as not really human rights questions, and organizations have been working to break down this barrier, in some cases quite successfully. If you evaluate the international narrative today and the extent to which countries are attempting to adopt the language into law, it is becoming a bit more commonplace. It is not occurring at as great a rate as hoped, but Northern European countries and some Western European domestic policies are very reflective of these human rights values. The authors hope to create a new narrative associated with women's rights, and they argue that creating new narratives has happened before around two basic areas. One is the disappearances, which were not considered human rights abuses before Argentine women protested and demanded accountability for crimes, and in so doing created a context for expanding the concept of responsibility for deaths at the hands of military of right-wing death squads, either allowed or directed by government. Another example is the concept of civil rights violations, including hate crime violence that is motivated by the race or sexuality of the victim. Many accept that states have to work to prevent such types of abuses. Beginning in the 1990s, adding women to the list of statuses that can motivate hate crimes has been on the agenda and is covered under hate crime legislation today. At the federal level, a hate crime is defined as a crime motivated by bias against race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. The UN today seems to have adapted its language to the suggestions put forth by activists and organizers and scholars during the 1990s. From their website, gender equality is at the very heart of human rights and United Nations values. Protecting and promoting women's human rights is the responsibility of all states, yet many women around the world continue to experience discrimination in many forms. For example, laws and policies prohibit women from equal access to land, property, and housing, economic and social discrimination, gender-based violence, denial of sexual and reproductive health rights. Discrimination based on sex is prohibited under almost every human rights treaty, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which, under their common Article 3, provide for the rights to equality between men and women in the enjoyment of all rights. In addition, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is dedicated to the realization of women's human rights. Considered the International Bill of Rights on Women, the Convention defines what constitutes discrimination against women and sets an agenda for national action to end such discrimination. The Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, which calls for the increased participation of women and the incorporation of gender perspectives in all UN peace and security efforts. This included participation of women in decision-making in peace processes, gender perspectives in training in peacekeeping, and gender mainstreaming in UN reporting systems. Since 2000, when this adoption of 1325 occurred, the UN Security Council has adopted several resolutions on women, peace, and security. In 2008, it adopted Resolution 1820, the first devoted to addressing sexual violence in conflict situations. The subsequent follow-up resolutions 1888, 1889, 1960 have focused on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence and have established the UN architecture to this end, including the appointment of a special representative on sexual violence and conflict, and the establishment of a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and conflict. Women's participation in the political system is another area of concern for international and domestic actors alike. Many believe that some of the problems of inequality are illustrated by women's lack of representation in government institutions, and also posit that increasing women's presence in key positions could work to combat systematic forms of discrimination that keep women from enjoying full human rights. The Interparliamentary Union, organized through the United Nations, is the global organization of national parliaments, and their website has data on legislative bodies around the world. They collect information on women in parliament. They report the global average for women in parliaments is about 24%. The United States comes in at about the global average, below most of the other American countries as well as most European countries. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has also provided information on female genital mutilation, a global practice that impacts more than 200 million women and girls across 30 countries. The practice is largely concentrated in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, but takes place in every country in the world. The practice is generally considered a cultural or religious practice, and as such, it has been difficult to get international attention and cooperation on this issue. Even more recently, the question of genital cutting has been extended to questioning the medical necessity of male circumcision, even though it is less controversial. But some say both types of circumcision, mutilation, are violations of human rights of women, girls, and boys. The practices seemingly violate the Convention on the Rights of Children, in addition to the Political Covenant. Since 1997, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Children Fund, and the UN Population Fund have made efforts to counteract FGM through research within communities and by influencing public policies. These efforts include wider international involvement to stop FGM, international monitoring bodies and resolutions that condemn the practice, revised legal frameworks, and growing political support to end the practice, including a law against FGM in 26 countries in Africa and the Middle East, as well as in 33 other countries with migrant populations from FGM practicing countries. The prevalence of FGM has decreased in most countries, and an increasing number of men and women in practicing countries support ending it.